Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Linda McCarter, and on behalf of APA Publications team, I'd like to welcome you to the first webinar in our Essentials of Qualitative Methods book series. In today's webinar, Drs. Clara Hill and Sarah Knox, authors of Essentials of Consensual Qualitative Research, as well as editors of this book series, will introduce you to their approach. The book featured in today's webinar is one of 6 that we released in January in this series of brief practical texts that introduce social science and psychology researchers to key approaches to qualitative research. This family of methods offers exciting opportunities to gather in-depth data and develop rich and useful findings. In the fall, we will be releasing 6 more books in this series. And at the end of this webinar, you will get information on how to sign up for future webinars and how to order these books using a special discount code. And be sure to visit our series page for more details on the series and the books. And now I'm most pleased to introduce our speakers today who will continue with the presentation. Clara Hill is professor at the University of Maryland and president of the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. Clara has a long history with the APA Books family, beginning with her textbook Helping Skills, which is now in its 5th edition. And Sarah Knox, professor at Marquette University, who is currently the co-editor of Counseling Psychology Quarterly. And now to our speakers.
We're delighted to be here today to introduce you to Consensual Qualitative Research, or CQR. We started developing this method about 30 years ago. Seems incredible, but it was about 30 years ago because we were so disillusioned with traditional quantitative research in terms of helping us get at some of the questions we were most interested in. So this method is one we've been kind of tinkering with over the years, and we keep coming up and revising it, and so this is the latest version. CQR is particularly ideal for accessing inner experiences. By inner experiences, I mean things you can't really observe. Sometimes you don't even know what you're thinking about until you start talking about it. Lots of times we have these experiences, but they're so hard to get at. And so sometimes we have to really reflect, and this is a way to get people's reflections to see what they're really thinking underneath.
Another great use for CQR is when phenomena really just don't occur all that often. They're rarely occurring experiences. And so qualitative methods in general and CQR in particular is an excellent way to really get at these unusual phenomena, dig into them deeply, explore them, and really sort of unpack them to see what's going on in that phenomenon.
And also it's very useful for getting in experiences that you just don't really access well through self-report or observer-rated measures. Self-report, somebody, they give you a question and they say rate it on a 1 to 5. And people usually go through those self-report measures so quickly, just tick off a 3. What does a 3 mean? And so we really want to get to what are their feelings, attitudes, belief, inner experiences in depth, not just responding to a quick question.
And then a final ideal use for CQR is when the literature really doesn't have much in it, whether it's theoretical or empirical literature. If there's an area that really hasn't been examined or explored yet, CQR is a great way to just do some initial, but also very deep and intense investigations into those types of topics.
Okay, so some of the key features of CQR. First of all, it's inductive or bottom-up. And by that, I mean, we don't set up with hypotheses. We don't review the literature and say, well, based on this literature, here's what I expect to find, because we're really afraid of a lot of researcher bias coming in there. We really want to learn from the participants and learn from what they're feeling and thinking. So it's bottom up. The ideas come from the bottom and we construct what we think based on the participants, what they've said.
And then related to that is the way we actually gather the data is through open-ended questions. So we're not asking yes/no questions. We're not asking people to rate things on a scale. We're asking literally quite open-ended questions. Something along the lines of, what was it like when your therapist disclosed to you? Or tell me about your experience of giving a gift to your client. So very broad, open questions that really evoke rich data from the participants.
Interestingly, and one of the ways we differ from some other qualitative methods is we have a semi-structured interview method where we ask the same questions of everybody so that we get a consistent data set. We want to know what everybody thinks about a particular topic, but we also, it's semi-structured in that we can go deeper on any topic. We can do lots of follow-up questions. One of my students had a great technique each time was, tell me more, tell me more. And people can keep coming up with more because this is a very reflective type of thing that people really start delving into their inner experiences.
And so the data in CQR are words, narratives, stories, tales, as people describe often pretty intense and profound experiences. So again, we're not dealing with numbers, we're not dealing with statistical tests, but the data are these rich, incredibly rich stories, words that participants share with us related to the question driving the study.
Context is crucial. Obviously, people don't just say one thing. We have to look at it within the context of everything they say and everything we know about them. So we really look closely at the whole interview to try to make sense of each part of the interview.
And so given the richness of the data, typically CQR has relatively small samples, at least small in comparison to traditional quantitative research. Usually we're shooting for at least 8 participants and often in the neighborhood of 12 to 15, something like that. And given the quantity of data, the richness of those data, those small samples make analyzing those data more manageable. So small samples are the norm here.
One of the things I really like about CQR, especially in comparison to the kind of research I used to do with training judges and having to have them come up to reliability, is this idea of multiple perspectives. And what's so freeing is to realize that everybody has a really different perspective on the same thing. And by hearing all the different perspectives, we can begin to make more sense of a phenomenon.
And so those multiple perspectives feed naturally into this idea of consensus, which is an absolutely essential component of CQR. And that's at each stage of the data analysis, and we'll talk about those stages later on, the research team reaches consensus in their understanding of the data. And so that, Claire and I used to argue early on in my work with her, was it discussing to consensus or arguing to consensus? You can take your perspective on that you wish, but yeah, the team really has to arrive at consensus in terms of all of the 3 main stages of the data. What do they mean? Where do we put them? Things like that.
Another way that we differ from some other qualitative methods is we stay pretty close to the data without interpreting, without inferring what the person might mean. We're not guessing what they mean beyond what they say. We're trying to stick pretty closely to a descriptive notion of what they're telling us.
And so as part of that, or related to that also is an acknowledgement, an upfront acknowledgement of what the researcher's biases and expectations are. And ideally this occurs before you've even collected any data, where the entire research team sits down and communicates verbally or orally, what are their biases related to the topic? For example, back to the therapist self-disclosure study. As therapists, have they ever disclosed? What are their thoughts and feelings about that? What do they think is good disclosure versus bad disclosure? Or if they've been a client, if they've experienced disclosure from their own therapist, their experiences like that. Because those experiences can inform how they view the data and how they understand the data. So that transparent, open discussion about the sort of the lenses through which each person might be viewing the data is key to this particular method.
And the idea here that there's no single truth is really crucial. In quantitative research, we tend to look for truth. We tend to look for the answer that tells us something about the world. But in qualitative research, we really know that the way each of us interprets something, each of the way we come to it, we bring our biases and expectations. We're aware that we want that out front so that we can say that. When I started this, I thought, well, 2 different research teams would come up with pretty much the same thing. Well, they do to an extent, but there's a lot of differences based on the research team. So we're not aiming for truth. We're aiming for a representation of the data. And we continually return to the raw data to keep anchored in what the participants said and ensure that our understanding is as clear and accurate as possible. So we don't say, you could keep going off of these multiple perspectives. Everybody starts free associating, but we really want to come back and say, no, what did the participants say? Let's go back. And so we go back multiple times throughout the process.
So one of the questions people often have when they're thinking about using a qualitative method, in particular with CQR, is, well, what types of questions are even viable here for this particular type of research? And so what we have here is a sampling of just 5 different types of questions, some of which we have actually explored, some of which we haven't. But it gives you a flavor of, what kinds of questions is CQR suited to answer. So we've referred to this study on clients experiences giving gifts to their therapists. That was an actual study that we did, which was fascinating. And so it gives a representation of the types of questions that can be used in CQR.
Another one we did was looking at what challenges advisors have in working with their students. We know that, that's different from psychotherapy, but advisors and advisees often come into a lot of challenges.
We've also done a fair amount of research on supervision, asking supervisees and supervisors about their experiences in the supervision relationship. And so that's another fruitful area that CQR can help you examine.
Now, we haven't done this study, but you could easily do a study looking at feelings you have about the presidential election.
Yeah, that would be an interesting study to do these days, yeah. And then just another example, again, more current topic types of things in terms of, everyone throughout the entire world is dealing with COVID, with the pandemic. And it would be fascinating to ask people to study, how have they managed it? How have they coped? What have been the challenges to it? What have been maybe some of the unanticipated benefits of the pandemic?
Okay, so now we want to kind of get into the main steps of CQR, and this is going to be brief, but we will go over it in great detail in the book. So this is just to give you a little taste. But the very first thing is you really have to identify and seek a relatively homogeneous sample. If you don't get a relatively homogeneous sample, you get data that's all over the place. So our participants are the experts in the phenomena. So we need to get, if we're looking at doctoral students, we want to get doctoral students in a particular program so that we have some commonality of experience. If there's not some commonality of experience, you're going to have all kinds of variant results that we then have a hard time saying anything about the sample.
And then when you go to actually gather your data, we can't stress enough how important it is to spend time, a lot of time potentially, developing a good semi-structured interview protocol, because that's how you gather your data. And for me, when I'm working with students or colleagues, I anticipate spending, a month or more just developing and tweaking and fine-tuning the interview protocol. Because if you don't have a good protocol, you're not going to get good data, and it's just going to be a very frustrating and unfulfilling study. So you develop a semi-structured interview protocol, and by that we mean, as Clara mentioned earlier, you ask the same questions of all participants, but based on their responses, you also kind of tweak things a little bit and follow up in terms of what they said. And we in CQR, we do look at the literature. We want to know what's out there already. So, we know what the gaps are in the literature and how we can try to fill some of those gaps. We also do 2 to 3 to 4 pilot interviews, again, just to refine the interview protocol to make sure it's a good, viable instrument to gather the data that we need.
So now you have your data, you've done your interviews, you've transcribed them. That's a huge amount of work already, but now we go to analyze the data, and we're going to talk about 3 main steps. The first 2 are within cases. So we spend a lot of time up front within each case. First of all, we try to determine what the domains are. And domains are topics. So it might be topics or like, why did you go to therapy? What was your experience of the therapeutic relationship? Those might be the domains. Okay, so those, we're just chunking the data from the interview and plopping them into domains.
Yeah, and with domains, it's really, there's not a whole lot of interpretation that goes with that. It's really more of an organizational step of moving the data into their topic areas. With core ideas, the second step, we're still within the cases, but with core ideas, you begin to do some really analyzing of the data where essentially with core ideas, you have a bunch of data within a domain, and the core ideas are concise summaries of those data, sticking as close to the participant's words as possible. So the participant may, have an entire paragraph talking about something, and the core ideas might be 3 or 4 statements that reflect as completely and as accurately as possible what the participant said, but more concisely.
Right, and these are obviously very challenging to do. It's always very challenging to figure out what's important to leave in or leave out. And so we talk about that a lot in the book. Now, once we've done within the cases, each case we now have a consensus version, which has for each domain, all the raw data and all the core ideas. We then go across cases because we want to figure out across this sample of 12 to 15 participants, are there any patterns or themes that we can identify? So if we look for one time at meaning in life for experienced therapists, what did they think about it? Well, we want to know, was there consistency across these experienced therapists? And in fact, one of the things they talked about was how they got other oriented meanings from working with clients. In other words, they helped other people. That was very gratifying. But they also got self-oriented meaning. In other words, it felt good. They felt gratified being able to be helpful. So those 2 themes came out across cases, and it was just really nice to see. And by the time we had finished, up to 10 or 11 cases, we were starting to get a lot of repetition of the themes, which is what you want. If you have a nice homogeneous sample, you're going to get repetition of the themes. There's going to be some individual things, but there's going to be a lot of themes or patterns among the sample, and that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, we've noted here on the slide the within cases versus across cases, and the first 2 steps are clearly within cases. You're looking case by case. With the cross analysis, you're finally looking across all the participants. So if you think of the old phrase, I can't see the forest through the trees. In the within case analysis, domains and core ideas, you're really looking at, you're looking at the trees and the leaves on the trees, and what do those leaves look like? With the cross analysis, for me, that's the most fun and the most exciting part of the process. And you finally are beginning to see, well, what does this whole forest look like? And so that's a really neat, exciting, wonderful part of the data analysis process. But as we do this, really at all stages of the data analysis, and particularly in the cross analysis stage, we are constantly revising. And as we said earlier, always returning to the interview data, because all of our findings, especially in the cross analysis, need to be fully grounded in those data. So even at the cross analysis, we may go back to an interview transcript and say, okay, what did they really say here, to make sure that we're capturing that accurately. So the data analysis really is an evolving project or an evolving document. The cross analysis is evolving throughout the latter stages of the data analysis, because what you're trying to identify is what is the clearest, most efficient, most elegant, most evocative way to convey your findings. And so that may mean in the cross analysis, there may be earlier categories that you decide to combine, or you may even decide to combine domains. So it's not set in stone, and it's a challenging part of it, but it's also an incredibly flexible and rich part of it, because it allows you to reach the best understanding of the data that you can. So the message here is, you may think, finally we got to the cross analysis, we're done. Well, you're partly done, but now it's a matter of really looking back and refining and creating the best understanding of the data that you can.
And along with that, the idea is what you're coming up with are surprising findings. You're not, again, this is bottom up. So we don't think that, okay, all of our domains come from research questions. They don't. It really is, what did the people say? And what you really are looking for in qualitative stuff is the things that came up that surprised you, that you hadn't expected. That's why we do qualitative research, because we don't know what we're going to find. And I just want to add another thing there, that when we're writing up the paper, you're continuing to revise it, because after we do the core ideas, when we actually write up the paper, we go back to the quotes from the participants. And again, we're thinking, now, is that really what happened? Does this category really fit? So we're constantly, again, all the way through the process up until the time that you send it off, when it actually gets published, you're continuing to revise and try to make it better. Sarah?
Yeah, so now in terms of advantages and disadvantages, on the advantage side of things, CQR really is, and I find it fun, it's engaging, you get to build really neat relationships with your research colleagues. So in terms of the researcher side of things, it really is an enjoyable process. It's also a social process. You know, sometimes people think of researchers of, being in their library carrel or in their office all by themselves and lonely. That's not CQR at all. Remember, the C part of CQR stands for consensus. And so this is a consensual process. You do it together. And then on the participant side of things, virtually every single time we will ask participants at the end of an interview why they chose to participate and how the experience of participation was for them. And I would say easily 98% of the time they say, I really enjoyed it. It allowed me to think through things I maybe hadn't thought through before. It allowed me to share my experiences to benefit other people. So it really can be fun for both researchers and participants.
And you get really close to the data. Unlike, if you do a quantitative study, and I still do plenty of quantitative studies, but we're just talking now about qualitative. What's nice is that data. By the time you're done with it, you are so immersed in the data that you can, there's pieces of qualitative data that still come back to me from studies from 30 years ago. So you're so close to it that it's part of you. So that's really important in terms of being able to know your data. And I just have to say that some of the doctoral students often will say, when they're doing a quantitative study, they get tired of it. They get tired of the whole thing. But when they're doing qualitative, they're still excited about the data when they're at the end of the process.
And CQR also really, as it says here on the slide, it does give voice to participants. It allows them to share some very profound, sometimes painful, sometimes joyous experiences. Claire was mentioning, remembering some of the data very vividly. I don't think I'll ever forget, we were doing a study on students' dissertation experiences. And one student said that student's advisor said to the student, I'm going to make you march across the burning sands of hell for your dissertation. That's a powerful, powerful statement. And it's hard to imagine, another, like a quantitative study that would allow that participant to share that experience. And so again, the advantages of CQR is it does give voice to people who may not have had an opportunity to share those experiences in another forum.
And I think we've kind of said this already, but it really does allow you to explore interesting phenomena that it's just really hard to get at some of these things in other ways. Like we're looking at challenges now. That kind of things, it's just really hard to do from another perspective. CQR also really facilitates you, the researchers, really deeply examining and understanding complex phenomena. We've talked about this idea of gifts in therapy, or Claire's done a lot of work on meaning in life. Those are not easy phenomena to approach, to do research on. And so CQR, qualitative research in general, and certainly CQR, provides you that opportunity to dig deeply into some really complicated, complex phenomena. And I think compared to some other qualitative methods, CQR is not only rigorous because it follows some particular steps, but it's relatively easy to learn. And I say that relatively because every time we write about this, we think we're being incredibly clear and everything's so easy to understand, but it is difficult comparatively. I mean, and so it's really important to study the method and hopefully learn it from an experienced person.
So on the flip side of things, every method has its advantages and disadvantages. And the first disadvantage here is, again, just sort of going back to what we said earlier about spend the time to create a really good interview protocol. That is in no way wasted time. It really is absolutely essential time up front, because as we said, if you don't have a good protocol, you're not going to get good data, and you're kind of sunk at that point.
It takes a lot of time and investment. You know, any good CQR project is going to probably take a couple years. And it's not the easy dissertation. I've sat on a lot of dissertations where somebody just throws a bunch of measures at participants and they get their data collected in a day. This is not that kind of thing. It does take a lot of time and investment.
Having said that, though, there are probably graduate students who are listening to this going, oh my gosh, I could never do that for my thesis or dissertation. You can. I am a testament to the fact that you can efficiently do and complete in a timely manner CQR projects and have them for your dissertation and have them for your thesis. It is possible to do. But, you know, as Claire was saying, it's not going to be, let me gather some quantitative measures and I can, you know, plug everything into SPSS and there are my findings. No, it's not that at all. It does take time and investment, but it's also for graduate students who might be listening, please don't be scared off. It's very possible to do in a timely manner, good, rigorous CQR projects. The team membership is also really, really important in that you're going to be working together on this project for a good chunk of time. And so, you know, I really try to make sure that the team members that I'm working with, we know each other well, we like each other, we get along with each other. If we have disagreements or conflict with each other, we're able to share that, to sort of talk about that, to put that out on the table and say, let's figure out what's going on here. The consensus process really demands that everybody be able to be transparent and thoughtful and respectful with each other. So spend a lot of time thinking about who's going to work well on your team, who's going to be able to play in the sandbox together.
So one of the big things we really have learned over the years is that every project is different and you don't know going in how difficult or complex it's going to be. I just can't emphasize that enough, because it would be nice to say, well, you just go through this step, and this step, but the different research questions require different things. So I can think of several studies where we went in and we thought, you know, the domains were going to be totally clear and we had to go in and totally revise what we were even doing with the domains. So it's challenging. So just leave it there.
And the last one is, I don't know so much of a disadvantage, but just sort of a reality in that qualitative methods in general are less well known by reviewers and editors. And so if you're seeking to publish your CQR study, just kind of know that you may well need to educate the editors and or the reviewers about what qualitative research is and specifically what CQR is. Claire and I certainly have, you know, had experiences, you know, submitting articles, getting reviews back, where you know, we really have needed to educate the reviewers and the editor about what are the expectations, what are the parameters of CQR, and so, you know, that's just kind of a fact of life right now.
And often when you're writing your paper up, you need to justify why you're using a qualitative method versus a quantitative method, and why among the qualitative methods you're using CQR versus some other method.
And we speak to that in the book as well. Yeah.
Okay, just very, very briefly, I want to go over some of the modifications of CQR. Again, I said we've been tinkering with this method for years. One modification is, we call it CQR modified. That's when you have simple data, like at the end of a survey, a quantitative survey, you might ask a couple open-ended questions and people write 2 or 3 sentences. And, you know, it's really a core idea already. So rather than putting them in domains, we have 2 questions, those are separate domains. We basically we have a team come up with categories and we just then plop the data in those categories. So it's still qualitative data, but it's very modified and simple. A second one is when we have cases. So a lot of times, since we're psychotherapy researchers, we observe a lot of psychotherapy issues. For example, currently we're doing a study looking at challenges within psychotherapy. And in this study, what we do is we basically interrogate ourselves. We have a team of 6 people and we identify a challenge event and we specify ahead of time what we're going to ask about the antecedent, what went on ahead of time, what did the client want from the therapist, and then we identify what was the type of challenge and what did the therapist want from the client? And then we look at the consequences. So instead of doing an interview, we're actually interviewing ourselves, and we're delving into the case as a whole, so we know as much context as possible about the whole case. Finally, we have qualitative meta-analysis. And I have to say that when I first started doing qualitative research, one of the big disadvantages was it felt like, well, each study just stands on its own. And we can't really say anything because we all know that no single study means anything. So the question is, how do you aggregate data across studies? And several other people have been doing similar things, and we came up with a way of doing qualitative meta-analysis, which basically is a cross-analysis of all the people's cross-analyses. So if you want a good example of this, a study that Sarah and I did with Kristen Pinto-Coelho, looking at therapist self-disclosures versus immediacy, was pretty cool because they have very different consequences. So even though they've been linked together, because immediacy is a kind of disclosure, but they're in reality very distinct, because self-disclosures make the clients feel supported. Immediacy makes them feel like they are being challenged and have to deal with problems in the relationship. So we ended up, because we had a number of studies, we were able to look across the studies and find consistent findings across studies. In the future, it'll be so much more exciting when there's a lot more qualitative studies that will have a lot of studies looking at the same phenomena.
So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, so where do I find some examples, good examples of studies that have actually used CQR and used it, following it very closely? So we point you here to 4 studies, a flavor of different types of topics, but all have really followed the CQR method very closely. And so these would be great resources for you. Claire's first study there, the top one looking at meaning in life. The second one looking at therapists being the target of hostile versus suspected unassertive client anger, so looking at anger in therapy. The study I've referred to a couple of times in terms of clients' experiences giving gifts to therapists. And then a more recent one looking at the phenomenon of crying in psychotherapy. And here looking at the perspective of both therapists and clients. So if you're looking for, okay, how do I, because we find the method makes a whole lot more sense if you actually read studies that have followed the method and sort of see what they do and what the findings are that they come up with. So these will be 4 good ones really just to kind of start that off with.
Okay, and just as we're closing down here, we've just been able to get a small taste of what's going on here, but we just want to tell you about a webinar that we're doing for the Society for Psychotherapy Research on Monday, March 29th at 2 p.m. And this is on subgroup analyses within CQR. The whole idea of, if we have one group of satisfied supervisees versus dissatisfied, what are the differences among them? What are the differences among inexperienced therapists versus experienced therapists? So when we want to do those subgroup analyses, how do we get into that? So this will give you a little bit more in-depth thing on CQR. And I do remember seeing a comment that somebody put in earlier about all our slides. We could send you the slides, but also this is just all right out of the book. So if you get the book, this is everything we've said today is basically an outline of everything in the book. And now it's time for some questions and answers.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma and I work for the American Psychological Association. I'm going to be leading this Q&A today. Claire and Sarah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. We have a lot of questions about methodology in the chat and kind of the best practices for coming up with a sample group, and how many questions do you include in each study, how many participants are good in each sample group, do you use a consent form in advance of the sample? Just could you talk a little bit about those practices?
There's a lot of them there. I'll start with the number of questions per interview. We found in the past that 8 to 10 questions per hour is good. If you ask too many questions, which is a real temptation, because once you start asking questions, you have 30 or 40 you want to ask. But what happens is then you tend to get thin data. And it tends to be where people don't, it almost like just answering factually. So what you want to do is take your time with each question, and you ask the question, you ask more about it to get them to go into depth about it. So 8 to 10 per hour is about the maximum. And we do send the protocol to participants ahead of time. That's controversial, but we really feel like for the most part, people need, for two reasons. They need a chance to think about it ahead of time, and ethically, they need to know what they're getting into before they get into an interview, because what we found is very often people end up revealing things that they hadn't expected to, because if we're good interviewers, we ask questions that get them thinking. So they need to be kind of aware ahead of time of where they want to go with the interview. Sarah, can you remember any of the other questions?
Another one was sort of, I think it was how we get our participants. And again, that varies study to study. You know, if your participant pool is going to be graduate students, then, you know, you could, I'm an academician, and so there might be connections I have through my program, and then snowballing off of that. There are some various listservs. I mean, most of the recruitment, in all honesty, these days is online. I've had some recent doctoral advisees do recruitment for their dissertations through online blogs and like things like Reddit and things like that. So, you know, it's depending upon your topic, that'll lead you in different directions. You just, some projects, it is very hard to get participants, and so you have to be creative and sort of persevere at it. Recently am doing a study right now where, and I've rarely had this happen, but felt great that it did, where within about a week of my initially sending out recruitments, I had all the participants, and it's just a matter of sort of what your topic is, people's interest in it whatsoever. So it certainly takes thought and some creativity and persistence to get the sample that you're looking to get.
It's interesting, just to build on that. One of the things we did a little qualitative meta-analysis about is why do different people participate? And so we were able to break it down into graduate students versus professional psychologists. And graduate students tended to participate when we asked them why they did, because of research karma. You help someone else, they help you. Whereas professional psychologists tended more to only participate if they were particularly interested in the topic and knew the people doing the study. So, you know, people have different reasons for participating. Emma, could you repeat some of the other questions so we could?
Actually, I have a couple more questions if you guys wouldn't mind veering off on kind of a different topic. Thank you all so much for participating. We have hundreds of questions to go through, so we won't get through them all. But would you ladies mind talking a bit about how we could apply CQR into psychotherapy sessions? Lots of people have questions about how you would use that outside of a study and more in psychotherapy.
Well, that would be the CQR case approach that I was talking about, where in the example I was mentioning, we watch the whole session, and then we interrogate ourselves about, we have standard interview questions that we ask ourselves. So, and we talk about it as a group, and oftentimes spend, you know, almost half an hour going over antecedents, and because we're really thoroughly trying to get at and understand what's going on in this situation. So that's how we would do psychotherapy sessions, where we're observing them.
Another question we have a lot is how do you guys have any tips or best practices for keeping your own personal bias out of the study? How do you make sure your data reflects what's actually happening, and, you know, not overanalyze or kind of put yourself too much in the studies?
Yeah, that's a really important question. You know, I think in part that's that conversation that you have early on before you gather any data about what all the researchers' expectations and biases are. And like with my teams, we based on the interview protocol, I'll generate maybe 3, 4, 5 questions that everyone on the team responds to in writing, and that document is sent around to the entire team. And then we discuss it in a meeting. One of our research meetings is actually talking through that. And so, you know, not only am I as an individual aware of what my biases might be, but I'm also aware of the other researchers' biases and their experiences. And so during the data analysis process, you know, we call each other on it, we challenge each other. And, you know, we may say, you know, I know that you've had some experience with this. I'm kind of wondering if that might be influencing how you're looking at the data. So it's just a matter of being transparent, honest, forthright, upfront, and just, being willing to not only analyze yourself intrapersonally, but also challenge the other folks on the team, and at each stage of the data analysis process. The other way we the other way we attend to that is we always use auditors for the data analysis. So you have someone who is totally external to the primary research team. They've not done the interviews, they've not been involved in the main part of the data analysis, but they're an auditor. So after you've done your core ideas, for example, you'll send your core ideas and the data that yielded them to the auditor, and then he or she will look through them. And there's, their primary purpose is to say, have you accurately and completely captured the data in those cores? But a secondary purpose is also to say, are your biases getting in the way? And so, the auditing process is another good check on that on that possibility as well.
Another question we have is about how you build your teams. Are there any tips or tricks you have for picking researchers on your projects? Is there a specific number of researchers you like to have partner with you? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Good question. Yeah, how many people on a research team? It really depends on the team. Minimum of 3, I would say, but a lot of our teams have 6 or 8. Sometimes we get a large team, and then after we've gone through a lot together, we divide up and have, like we might pair up, especially with domains, because once you've done 4 or 5 interviews, domains are relatively easy. And then sometimes we can do core ideas in pairs, but then everybody looks at it at some point so that everybody has equal access to the data. But there are some ways of kind of, once everybody really understands the process, that we can kind of speed up that process a little bit.
And in terms of creating the team, I try to work with people that I like working with, and that I know we're going to work well together. And when I invite people onto a study, I'm very upfront about what the process is going to look like, how much time it's going to take, what the expectations for involvement are, all those kinds of things. And I'm also upfront in terms of my particular, if I'm leading the project, I'm also upfront in terms of my particular style, in that I work, we keep working. We'll keep even working through the summers, there may be a little bit of a lighter tempo there, but it's a commitment of, an hour to 2 hours every week. And so, if people are interested in doing that and have the time and want to make that commitment, I welcome them. But if they're not sure, then I would rather them say no up front than get on, and then there will be problems later on. So, it's people that I like to work with, people that I know we're going to work well together, and people that, are able to sometimes engage in difficult conversations if there are disagreements within the team. Picking the good team is really, really important.
There's a lot written about picking teams, obviously, and not only in qualitative research, but in industrial organizational psychology. You do want people who kind of share some thinking to some degree, but you don't want people who exactly think alike, because you want people to challenge your thinking. But if people think too differently, you never come to consensus. So, especially depending again on the topic, you do need some people who represent the different aspects of the topic. So there's a lot of thinking that goes into thinking who's on the interview team and who does the interviews.
Well, ladies, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all so much for participating today. We do have a ton of questions in the chat that we weren't unable to get to in this Q&A, but we will follow up with all of you outside of this webinar. We'll try to answer all of your questions via email. Claire, would you mind clicking to the next slide? Perfect. Just so everybody knows that we have other webinars coming up. There were lots of questions in the chat and in the Q&A about how to sign up for those. So you can just go to this link right here, which my colleague Jason has placed in the chat. So if you want to sign up for our future webinars, you can go there. We'll also be sending out the recording of this webinar and a copy of the PowerPoint to all participants after the webinar. So you'll all have access to that. Additionally, thank you for participating. We're happy to offer you guys a discount using this code in all caps on our website, apa.org, to get a discount on your purchase of these books. You can apply it to all the books in the series, but also, the one we talked about today. And there's a survey coming up as soon as we end this presentation. Anyways, thank you guys so much for participating, and we hope you'll join us for the rest of the webinars we have coming up this spring. Thank you, ladies. Your presentation was wonderful. There are so many questions.
Thank you, guys. Okay, I'm going to end this meeting. Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.